Thanks everybody for the opportunity to speak today. It's great to go last on this panel because by now we have a sense of the challenge of sustainably feeding 9.5 billion people by 2050. So I'm not going to go into too much doom and gloom. We've already seen that. I'll add a little bit of doom and gloom, but then hopefully go straight into solutions. So I'm going to be talking about research that we've done over the last 3 years at the World Resources Institute. This series called Creating a Sustainable Food Future. So the World Resources Institute, we're a global research organization. We work in about 50 countries on issues at the intersection of environment and development. And we focus on 6 key sustainability issues: food, forests, water, climate, energy, and cities. So arguably, sustainably feeding the planet by mid-century impacts all of these issues. We've done this work with a few partner organizations: the UN Development Program, UN Environment Program, the World Bank, and 2 agricultural research agencies, CIRAD and INRA. And financial support for this research was provided by Norwegian, the Dutch, Danish Ministries of Foreign Affairs, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, UNDP, UNEP, and the World Bank. So by now, we've talked about this. This is our overall question: how can we feed more than 9 billion people in 2050 in a manner that advances social and economic development and reduces pressure on the environment? So as Jack stated, the world needs to close a food gap. Between now and 2050, we need to have 70% more calories available relative to today if we are to adequately feed more than 9 billion people. At the same time, we need agriculture to continue to support economic development. More than a quarter of the world's population is somehow engaged in agriculture and derives their livelihoods from it. And at the same time, we need to reduce agriculture's impacts on the environment. Now, and we're looking at the same environmental impact that the other speakers have already highlighted: greenhouse gas emissions, land use, and agriculture's water use. So I won't go too much more into that. This is my gloom and doom slide here, which is if we wanted to produce If we wanted to close the food gap by producing 70% more food between now and 2050, it's going to be very difficult to do this, because if we look back at you see the yellow bar on your left, between 1962 and 2006, is the period that included the Green Revolution. Agriculture was phenomenally successful in boosting yields. But if we want to produce 70% more food between now and 2050 without converting new land, yields are going to have to grow at a rate of 1/3 more per year than they did over the previous 40 years. This is a huge challenge. So what I'll be talking about is a menu of solutions that we can implement to sustainably close the food gap, looking at both producing more food in a sustainable way and also trying to alter consumption patterns. And this is how we're defining sustainability under this effort, and there's a lot of overlap with what others have said. But for each strategy for a sustainable food future, it has to alleviate poverty and contribute to economic development. It has to benefit both women and men, and it has to reduce pressure on ecosystems, particularly forests, water, and the climate. So our menu for a sustainable food future separates into 3 main courses. And the first is the consumption side. And this is things like reducing food loss and waste. These are all strategies that can reduce the growth in demand projected between now and 2050. On the production side, I'll be talking through menu items that are mostly about sustainable intensification, of producing more food on the same amount of land, be it crops, livestock, or aquaculture. And finally, there's this third course, which we're calling production methods, and these are strategies that don't necessarily increase the food supply, but will reduce agriculture's greenhouse gas emissions. So for instance, managing rice paddies and interrupting the flow of irrigation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions while not affecting yields. So diving right into the menu. The first item on the menu is reducing food loss and waste. Now this is a big issue. Anne touched on this. A commonly cited statistic from the FAO is that about 1/3 of the world's food supply is lost or wasted between the farm and the fork. This is an enormous inefficiency. This is calculated by weight. We converted this to calories, and it's still huge, 24%. So essentially, 1 out of every 4 calories intended for human consumption is ultimately not consumed by people. So taking a closer look at where food is being lost or wasted starts illuminating what we can do to reduce rates of food loss and waste. So if you look over on the left-hand side, these are the lower income regions, such as Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. And you see a lot of the loss and waste happens at the production, handling, and storage stages. So a lot of the solutions here are going to be about reducing post-harvest losses using low-cost and appropriate technologies. You look over on the right side, as regions get richer, you see, such as North America, the vast majority of the waste is at the consumption stage. So this is food that's being thrown away in the home, at restaurants, by retailers, and so on. So a lot of the solutions here are going to focus on changing consumer behavior and also changing policies and practices in the restaurant industry by food retailers, cafeterias, and so on. So this is a big problem, but it also suggests that it's a big opportunity. And we estimate that if you cut the rate of food loss and waste in half by 2050, it would reduce the food gap by more than 20%. So just through this one strategy, if we can implement it successfully, we're already 1/5 of the way there to sustainably feeding the planet. And so we've been working for the last year or so with leading organizations to develop a globally consistent food loss and waste measurement protocol. Because one of the barriers to reducing food loss and waste is that the data tend to be pretty poor and not collected in consistent and credible manners. So we're developing essentially an accounting and reporting standard for food loss and waste so that countries and companies can set waste reduction targets, can monitor progress, and can think through strategies to reduce food loss and waste within their value chains. And so we'll be pilot testing this actually starting next month, working with Nestle and others. So if you're interested in this, please come find me after the talk. Next item on the menu, which has come up a few times already, is shifting diets. And there are 2 primary diet shifts that we're recommending. The first is reducing excessive calorie consumption, and the second is reducing excessive demand for animal products, especially beef, because of its outsized environmental impacts, as has been mentioned by the other speakers. So the key word here is really excessive. We're talking about reducing overall demand for food in ways that don't compromise nutritional outcomes. And so today, there's overconsumption primarily in the industrialized countries, right here in the US, in Europe, and so on. But looking out to 2050, the emerging economies like China and others are going to be consuming per capita roughly at the rate that this country is today. And so it's working in both types of areas to do these diet shifts. And so we estimate that if we were to eliminate obesity by 2050 and reduce the incidence of overweight by half by 2050, it would reduce the food gap by an additional 6%, which is a step in the right direction. And on the animal product side, this has been mentioned a little bit, but so we're looking at an overall 70% increase in food demand, but demand for animal products is projected to go up even higher. And this is because of rising incomes and urbanization. So we're looking at an 80% projected increase in animal product consumption across the board, and a 90% projected increase in beef consumption. So this has big implications for sustainably feeding the planet, because the more animal products we consume, the more land we're going to have to devote to producing feed. And already about 1/4 to 1/3 of crops are used to feed animals today. And again, we're calling out beef especially because it's a far less efficient source of calories and protein than other animal products. You see over on the left, only about 1% of calories in, which includes both feed and grass, then produce calories that are edible by humans. And if you look over on the right, poultry, fish, and eggs, these animal products are 10 times as efficient from that perspective. And so resource use then follows from this. Beef has very high, 6 times as high greenhouse gas emissions, for example, per unit of protein than pork and chicken and eggs. So again, this diet shift, this menu item is really about managing future growth in meat demand. It's not about everybody going vegetarian, or it's not about abolishing the US meat industry or something. It's about really managing this 80 to 90% growth in meat demand. So biofuels, another challenge. So I just talked a little bit about the implications of using crops and cropland for food versus animal feed. Well, now increasingly we're using cropland to fuel cars. And the implications of this for a sustainable food future are potentially quite large. So to give you an example, the US and the EU currently have mandates in place that say I think in the US it's by 2020, an amount equivalent to 10% of transportation fuel needs to come from biofuels. Now, if such a target were to go global in 2050, 10% of all global transportation fuel, that would take about a third of current global crop energy. And in turn, that would only produce 10% of the transportation fuel and only 2% of total global energy. So we're talking about a relatively small amount of energy taking an enormous amount of cropland. And so if we need to produce more food on the same amount of land to feed people, if we can continue to increase bioenergy mandates, it's going to make it much more difficult to do so without converting more forests. So if the world were to go in the other direction and phase out the use of crops for biofuels by 2050, it would reduce the food gap by about 15%. And so the final menu item on the demand side is achieving replacement level fertility. And it's interesting how Jack was talking about peak child. So this is essentially a story about sub-Saharan Africa. And that's because if you look at current fertility rates, this is in the yellow bars, pretty much all regions in the world are right around the replacement level, which is roughly 2.1 children per woman. Sub-Saharan Africa is the exception, with a fertility rate still of over 5. And looking forward to 2050, all regions except Sub-Saharan Africa are projected to reach replacement level fertility, but Sub-Saharan Africa is still projected to be around 3. This is the UN fertility projections and where their population projections come from. So there is potential for fertility rates to decline rapidly. If we look at what's happened over history, this shows over a 50-year period from 1960 to 2010, countries from different regions, different stages of economic development, all decreased their fertility rates from between 6 and 8 to between 1.5 and 2.5 today. And they did this mostly through education and health measures, increasing access to girls' education, reducing child and infant mortality, and increasing access to reproductive health care, including family planning. And so these are measures, these education and health measures that African governments are already actively pursuing in the name of education, health, and economic well-being. But this could also help close the food gap. So if the entire world were to achieve replacement level fertility by 2050, that would lower the population projection by about 400 million people and reduce the food gap by additional 10%. And this is even more significant for sub-Saharan Africa because since population growth is projected to be quite high, food demand is also projected to be really high, and so their food gap is a lot bigger. And so achieving replacement level fertility would reduce sub-Saharan Africa's food gap by about 25%. So the insight here is really that there's a lot that we can do on the demand side to close the food gap. If we implemented all of these perfectly, maybe we get about half of the way there, but we will still need to sustainably increase food production. So turning to the production side, there's a couple more challenges. And the first is that as climate change progresses, it's going to have increasingly negative impacts on crop yields, especially in the developing tropics, where a lot of this additional food will be needed. Water stress is also projected to increase in important agricultural areas. You see the red areas on the map, most of India, you see northeastern China, most of the African Sahel. And so agriculture going forward is not only going to have to be more efficient, but also more resilient to these types of stresses. So our first menu item on the production side, I was hoping to refer to Howard Shapiro's talk, which is going to be the shining example of this, but it was boosting yields through crop breeding, because we really have an opportunity today to combine conventional breeding with modern technology, genomics, marker-assisted breeding, and really speed up the crop breeding process. And also, if we're focusing not only on the heavily researched crops, but also on the so-called orphan crops, things like millet, sorghum, cassava, sweet potato, crops that are very important, especially in developing countries, but haven't had the same research attention paid to them, there's a real opportunity to boost yields. And also, we can use breeding to breed for better nutritional traits and also to reduce environmental impacts. So this is definitely an ingredient for a sustainable food future. Another thing we can do on the production side is to improve what we're calling land and water management practices. These are things like agroforestry, which is putting more nitrogen-fixing crops and shrubs on trees and shrubs on cropland, and water harvesting. So capturing more of the rainfall instead of having it run off. And so this is actually being implemented more and more across the African Sahel, and evidence shows that increasing these practices and then adding a little bit of fertilizer called microdosing can really boost yields. This is data from Burkina Faso. And we estimate that these practices could be scaled up on more than 300 million hectares across Africa's drylands. So this is an opportunity to, in an area where resources are quite scarce and where inputs are expensive, to boost yields in a sustainable way and in a way that's affordable to farmers. So we've talked quite a bit about palm oil, and so we've established that palm oil demand is going to grow very quickly between now and 2050, and there are other crops like soy, which are also projected to grow that fast. So if yield gains don't keep up, there will be pressure to continue expanding cropland. And so one thing that we could do is, instead of business as usual, which tends to be agriculture expanding into forests, we can divert that expansion onto what we're calling low opportunity cost degraded lands. So the best global example of this are the along grasslands in Indonesia, pictured here. And these are areas that have already been logged over, but where grasses have come and colonized it. And so if you were to leave these areas alone, the forests would not regenerate by themselves. So there really is, from an environmental standpoint, a low opportunity cost to expanding agriculture onto these lands. And if the lands are also not being, if there's not many people living on the lands and not many people using them already for economic activities, these are lands that can support additional cropping. And so we've been working in Indonesia for the last few years with palm oil companies, the government, and other stakeholders to map out areas of low opportunity cost degraded lands that are potentially suitable for oil palm, and to try to demonstrate the economic and social feasibility of this strategy. Another item will be to increase pasture land productivity. We saw that there's going to be a 90% increase in demand for beef, and there's also twice as much pasture land in the world as there is cropland. So there is enormous opportunity to do this. And the technical ways to do this are pretty well established at this point. It's planting better grasses and legumes, using better animal breeds, better feeding techniques, improving animal health. And so the technical potential is there, but the question remains, how much of this can we actually do? So this is, in a country like Brazil, where there's already been a lot of deforestation and where there's a lot of pasture land, there's a big opportunity to increase yields. Finally, we turn to fish. The story here is basically, historically we've gotten our fish from wild sources, from the oceans, from lakes, from rivers, and so on. But in the 1980s, the fish catch, from a global standpoint, peaked and really hasn't risen over the last 20 years, and in fact has declined a little bit. And meanwhile, world fish demand continues to go up relatively at that same linear rate. And so aquaculture, or fish farming, has expanded to meet world fish demand. It's the world's fastest growing animal food producing sector. So if these trends continue out to 2050, aquaculture is going to have to more than double production. So that is a growth that's going to have to be managed. So there's a couple things that we'd have to do. And the first is on the wild fish side. So the graph I showed with the wild fish catch leveling off also masks the fact that we are still fishing more and more. And so if you look at the health of marine fish stocks, more and more of them are being overfished. So this relative stability masks the fact that if we continue fishing at this level, there will be declines and possibly collapses in fish populations. And so what we need to do is reduce fishing effort and possibly fish catch level to a sustainable level. And at the same time, I mentioned that we have to double aquaculture's production. The sector is going to have to improve its productivity and its environmental performance. So this is kind of analogous to what terrestrial animals have to do. We need to produce more fish per unit of land, of water, of feeds, reduce greenhouse gas emissions from aquaculture, reduce water pollution, reduce incidences of disease. And this is really kind of a good news story because over the last 20 years, the industry has really moved in this direction. It's just we need to accelerate those gains if we're going to keep up with doubling production by 2050. So we're reasonably optimistic that these menu items, if implemented, could help and could close the food gap. And each one of them should also reduce agricultural greenhouse gas emissions and water use, but it's possible that we might have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions even more if we are to keep global warming below 2 degrees Celsius. And so that's the third category of our menu, the production methods. And this is really looking at the biggest greenhouse gas emitters in agriculture, livestock, fertilizer use, rice, and reducing greenhouse gas emissions from each of those. So it's kind of a whirlwind tour through the menu, but I'll leave you with a few takeaways. The first is that the challenge is big, but it's even bigger, I think, than commonly perceived. We have to produce a lot more food in an era of scarce resources and on the same amount of land, and this is going to be quite difficult to do. And the challenge is really most acute in sub-Saharan Africa. This is sort of a recurring thread running through the talk, but this is the region where population growth is highest, where crop yields are lowest, where there's already high percentages of poverty and hunger and so on. And so this is where a lot of the focus and investment will have to be. Another insight is that demand reduction really is important. A lot of the conversation about feeding the world by 2050 tends to center on producing more food. There is really a lot that we can do if we manage that growth in demand. And in that, bioenergy is also a potential game changer because, as I showed, just for additional amounts of energy, a lot of extra crops and land are required. On the production side, it's really more about more efficient use of inputs. And we need to boost crop yields, but policies that encourage boosting crop yields also need to be combined with protecting forests and other natural ecosystems. Because if we only boost crop yields, there could be an economic message to producers to then clear more land. Another recurring theme is there's lots of opportunities in the livestock sector, both on the consumption side, producing more and more efficiently, and on the consumption side, reducing excessive growth and demand. And the batteries might have just run out. Oh, okay, good. So then the last point, last but definitely not least, is that a lot of this research and a lot of what I've presented really has looked at the interplay between food availability and environmental sustainability. But when we're thinking more broadly about food and nutrition security and about the full suite of sustainability, right, also social and economic, we need to make sure that the way that each one of these menu items are implemented supports and improves agricultural livelihoods and also keeps food nutritious, safe, and affordable to people. And if we do that, we will have achieved a sustainable food and nutrition future. Thank you. So we do have time for some questions if people have them.
I have a question. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. And I'm curious, in your modeling of ways to meet this food gap, have you also looked at, I'll just call it urban sprawl, but especially since there is often an urban agricultural area that surrounds some cities, what about managing that to keep that land in crops as opposed to sprawl from urban centers?
Well, that definitely is. We haven't modeled that, but that definitely is an issue. I know in Asia, one of the issues is that cities are expanding so rapidly that land for cities is now encroaching on croplands, and it drives up the land. It drives up the land's value, right? And so, how to manage for that? I mean, again, that adds to the challenge, right? And so, it only underscores the challenge that we need to produce more food. We need to really boost yields.
Elaine Kroll, DuPont Nutrition and Health. It was very interesting. When you were talking specifically about food wastage and not utilizing all the, like using the, since we're in a Native American environment, using the whole buffalo as it were. I remember the scare about 2 years ago about the pink slime where they were taking parts, you know, the undesirable parts of the carcasses and mixing that. And actually from a nutrition point of view, it was actually adequate. But there was such a public outcry and there was a lack of communication on the part of the nutritionists and scientists that company went under. Right. And I'm sure that happens many more times that we were brought to awareness because it happened in North America. So how do we address the perception of taking these parts that, you know, it's one thing for an affluent society to turn their nose up at it being disgusting, but to feed the world essentially?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, it really speaks to the trade-offs between environmental sustainability and resource efficiency on one side, and whether you call it food safety or acceptance by consumers on the other side. So, I mean, I guess there's no one best answer for that. But again, that's another tension that's going to have to be managed, because there are certainly, I know in the research that I've done on aquaculture, it's the same thing. We can make more efficient use of the waste, and we can feed fish with more things. But then, is that going to be acceptable to the consumers if they learn everything that's in it? So that's definitely something, a tension that will need to be managed. Yep. And we have time for one more question.
Thank you. Fred Shinnick, Genomics. In listening to all of this morning, it occurred to me that sometimes we've made mistakes about what things we think are good to do or not do, and we've gone back and looked and realized these inputs go off and out of the way. And then thinking further about it, it seems like our standard for measuring all of these things in the past has always been cost. I'm looking at the food industry and what goes into it. And what I began to wonder about was, it looks now like we have to look at all of these processes and outputs in terms of all of the inputs to decide what the impact is on water, air pollution, the minerals we take out, the labor we put in. All of those things somehow have to all be mapped so you can make informed choices. Are people working on just that, you know, mapping these processes to look at all of these inputs so you can actually make informed choices? So what's the status of that?
Just to make sure I understand this, so are you talking about the costs of the inputs, or?
No, I'm not talking about, I'm talking about how much mineral has to go. So if you have a tractor out here that you're using to harvest crops with and stuff, and that's just one of the inputs in producing agricultural products. I mean, is someone mapping out, you know, in addition to the fact that you have to buy that tractor and put fuel in it and all that sort of stuff, what the cost of the metal that goes into that, you know, what the implications are in terms of the water that goes into making the metal that makes the tractor, what air pollution, I mean, it sounds very complex, but it seems like, is that what we have to do to sort out what the desirable solutions are and how to figure out the trade-offs? I would stop doing things if I knew for sure which ones were the most destructive to different kinds of things.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I think what you're speaking to is really the power of what life cycle analysis can bring, right? And looking at impacts from farm to fork in the case of food, and looking at what resources you need to put in and what kind of environmental impacts come out on the other side. And that really does, with that, you're able to start to quantify and, you know, compare apples to apples to say, you know, X is more resource efficient than Y. And then you can also layer economic and social layers on top of that too. So I know there's a lot of life cycle analysis focuses on environmental inputs and impacts, but you can also look at social, economic, political feasibility to try to figure out what the best steps forward are.